Ways of healing. If your dreams are plagued by mice, hot lavender porridge in the morning, if a sinister ha settles over the village, if a child's cries are thick with illness, rub unbroken eggs and rosemary sprigs across their body. Wave an eagle's feather any time you sense their fear for broken bones. Pass the child through a cleft in an ash sapling for a broken heart. Place rose quartz beneath your tongue. Grip your mouth shut. Hope for the best. After a negative pregnancy test, find a wet hill to roll down. Pout your lips whilst you roll. Kiss the ground as much as possible. Lie down in a bush of milkweed. Let its pearly sap ooze over your sunspots in damage. There is healing. My mother recommends rubbing hot vinegar across my breasts. I'm not sure what for. Before a party, stuff your bra with cabbage leaves for perkier nipples. Trust me. To draw blood from the earth, bury a spoon in the garden. A clover will grow. Pluck it. Place it on your tongue. It should dissolve, leaving behind a metallic taste. The morning after a breakup, strip down to your underwear on a public beach. Walk into the winter waves. This is as close as you'll get to being vulnerable again.
C'est la nuit. Pluie. Les lumières du cinéma se répètent par terre. La foule sort, se disperse. Restent deux femmes et un parapluie au coin de la rue. Papotage féminin de voix. La brune rit, secoue ses cheveux.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Poetry to Your Ears podcast.
Hello.
And today we have Charlotte Shevchenko Knight on the podcast. Hi, Charlotte.
Hello.
Charlotte is a British-Ukrainian poet with a master's from Goldsmiths University. She was recently commended in the National Poetry Competition and forms part of the Poetry Translation Centre's Undertow 8. Her work centres on womanhood, Ukrainian history, and folklore. She has written pieces for the United Nations, Magma and Magg, amongst others.
And
So
Ways of
lot-
Healing is her first poetry collection.
Yeah, which we have here.
So we're delighted to talk to you today about
And we have
your poetry book. And I think the
That's
first
right.
question that we wanted to ask you is how you started poetry. Like, what's your story with poetry?
Oh, I was talking to someone about this the other day. I think I was like 15 and I was like, I'm going to write the great novel. And I tried so hard to write this. I don't know what I was doing really. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. And I found that I was more interested in language than I was plot. And so I started reading some poetry and I realized that's where I kind of felt I was more leaning towards, and I just didn't have a lot of exposure to it. So I started reading a lot of poetry around then. And then when I was 16, I came to England and I started a creative writing A-level. And the tutor there was really encouraging and would take me to poetry events and get me to enter competitions. And it kind of just started from there.
Mm. So quite young then, you started poetry.
Yeah, it's been 10 years now, which is quite weird to think about. But yeah, I think like as a kid, I was very like lonely, and that was my way. Sorry, sorry. Yeah, I felt quite lonely as a child, and it was like my way of understanding other people was kind of through reading and writing.
Mm.
Did you read a lot of poetry growing up, or is that something that you came to later on?
It was definitely something I came to later on. I had no idea about it really. I think my parents aren't really readers. They don't really care too much for it. So I was just trying to find what I could when I'd go to a bookshop. I didn't really have much background knowledge. So yeah, no, I think it was the joys of being on Tumblr as a teenager that then introduced me to poets.
What did you think of poetry in school? Because we have a lot of feedback from poets we interviewed who didn't relate to poetry in school really.
Yeah, I found that with doing my A-levels here, that we were looking at a lot of the romantic poets, and I had no interest in it, and I kind of still don't. I can totally appreciate it, but I find myself continually drawn to, I'd say, probably poetry from the 50s, 60s onwards. And for me, that comes with like the rise of the confessional poets. So there's something that I can really like relate to there in terms of like Wordsworth has this like phrase, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's that poetry is the like as an emotional outburst. And I didn't find that when reading the Romantic poets. I found it when reading the confessionals. Like Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, there was just something there that was more revealing, and kind of there was something more at stake. And that's what I'm interested in. It's like this is maybe a silly comparison, but for instance, I don't like video games because the adrenaline that I get from that stresses me out. But the adrenaline I get from writing a poem that's personal, to me, that's the real thrill.
Wow. So yeah, so it's a real experience for you when you actually are writing. It's not like a kind of sanitary process. I'd say it's really involved.
No, it's definitely like rooting into your emotions and trying to find out, well, why do I care about this? Why am I writing about this? I obviously care. Why do I care? And digging into yourself.
Yeah, you on your Instagram you have a quote there where it says poetry presents us with a sense of truth, and I thought what was interesting about that is the use of sense rather than truth, you know.
Yeah, poetic truth and factual truth are two very different things, but I think I mean, yeah, I wrote this whole thing for the Poetry Translation Centre, and it was sort of around the time of when the war started in Ukraine this year, and I was thinking about there's so many poets over there still writing and campaigning and hosting events despite all the chaos around them, and it's because it's a way of dealing with that emotional truth that we're carrying. You can't. I think when you're trying to put something into words in a conversation, you might seem neurotic or like you're not making sense, but poetry is sense making, even if it isn't, for example, grammatically correct. That there's a sense of truth in there.
And you found a role, right, about the Ukrainian war. So you wrote an article for the United Nations, and you've been on TV as well.
Yes. Yeah. I had to do. I mean, at the time, I felt so kind of hopeless, and I was very stressed out. My family were still there, and I was trying to figure out what I could do to get the word out. So I did things like I did a New York Times interview. I wrote for the United Nations. We did a fundraising event called Poets for Ukraine, and that was an online thing. People could donate whatever they like to come watch, and we raised something kind of ridiculous that I didn't expect poetry could do, and it also kind of brought me to a lot of other poets who are of similar background to me, so either British-Ukrainian or Ukrainian-American, who are experiencing this bizarre conflict of identities at a time where it's really apparent. Sorry, I'm kind of losing track of it, but poetry was kind of the one thing that kept me grounded throughout all of that, because it was something I could throw myself into and hopefully make some difference, be it big or small. Yes, for sure. I started writing my new collection in October of last year, which was predominantly going to be about the Holodomor, which is a famine that occurred in Ukraine in 1932. And I started to see a lot of parallels between sort of Soviet interactions with Ukrainians then and Russian interactions with Ukrainians now. So the collection has evolved a lot into it tracks back from 1932 to today. So it's stretching across different eras. But yeah, a lot of content has come out of that. And I almost feel guilty in a way because I feel, I don't know, like when you go to read at a poetry event, I see my friends will read poems that make people like laugh or, love poems, and then I come on stage and I'm like, here's my poem about the war. So it's hard, but I do feel it's necessary too.
Mm. Yeah, I think there is room for diversity of poems and poetry and feelings in the poetry space, poetry events. So
Yeah,
Have
yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
for sure.
Have you always had such a tight connection with Ukraine in terms of, like being there, going there, it being conscious in your identity?
Yeah, I mean, as a child, so I grew up in Spain. I lived there for 10 years. We would go every summer for Independence Day in Ukraine. So that's like, I think it's the 23rd of August.
Where did you go
wrong.
in Ukraine?
But Kyiv, so the capital, my family were living there. And we would do this big event every year. Like all the family friends would gather. We would go to a restaurant in the forest, and we'd have our headdresses on, and you've got vyshyvankas, which are like these tunics that are embroidered with your local pattern. So each district has their own sort of embroidery. Yeah, it was always kind of it. I think when I was younger, I felt almost embarrassed by it because it harks to a different time, right? These sort of celebrations, and I didn't really share that a lot with people. It was only October last year I was on an Arvon course in Devon, and I was continuing to write poems like the ones in Ways of Healing, and Fiona Benson, who is now my mentor, she was teaching me there at the time. And she said to me, I can't give you any feedback on these poems because it feels to me that you already know what you're doing with them. There's nothing to change to them. And she said, you need to challenge yourself. What is something that you're afraid of writing about? And I said, Ukraine. And she went, okay, well, let's start from there. And so it's been an ongoing process of I write I probably write about 8 poems a month for it, and then Fiona and I call every 2 weeks to go over it together. It feels very it's a strange one. When I was writing Ways of Healing, I was very alone in that process. It's so different now to approach a new collection with someone else there to carry you through the process. Maybe carry is not the right word, but if I'm stuck, there's someone I can fall back on.
Yeah, so she's your first reader.
Yeah, definitely, and the best one too. I feel like Oh, sorry.
It's so vital to have that mirror.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because she knows me as well, so she knows what I'm trying to achieve. Um, yeah, it's really, really important to have that, and makes me feel supported. And it's hard when you're writing something so difficult, but she really holds my hand.
Do you have explicit poems about Ukraine or Ukraine?
They're all so I've just had 2 come out in the poetry review about the famine. And yeah, I was surprised that they took them because they are graphic depictions of that.
Any in
sort
Ways of
historical
Healing,
moment.
or does
Sorry?
that come out? Any? Have you written any in Ways of Healing, or does that
Included
come
in it.
out?
Oh, in Ways of Healing, not explicitly. There's elements of it with sort of folkloric kind of references. That's always something that I remember once someone at uni accused me of living in a poem because I thought romantically, and I wanted to tell her, well, that's just being Ukrainian.
Wow, that's nice. Do you want to read a poem of the collection?
Yeah, please. I was thinking about this a lot. I think I'd quite like to read Clinic the Winter Self, if you're happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Clinic the Winter Self. Part 1. Running into the sea fully clothed is a symptom. So are the crowds forming, the perpetual sunsets and sharp applause. I am sick with wanting. I just want to hold a child in the snow. I want to dab their face with antibacterial wipes. Part 2. After my January swim, which was more a thrashing in the waves lost in television static, I buy a coffee made the wrong way, milk first. Wet silk, beige gossamer twirling around a cup. I think back to the clinic. Paper cups atop a water cooler bubbling with mild anger. I just want an answer. Is depression a glitter? Does my empty womb mean something? Part 3. I was born in January. My mother was afraid to take me outside for fear I would inhale cold air and freeze from the inside out. I picture my childhood self as a small instrument made of glass into which air and spit is blown. It produces an awful whistling, which can only be heard by dogs. I am afraid of the sounds I make, the ways in which my body alienates others. I am afraid of the ceaseless winter of myself.
That's phenomenal.
Thank you.
I think a common thread that comes back in this collection is children, having a child.
Yes, yeah.
Do you want to expand on this?
Yeah, so it's not a fun one, but I had lost a pregnancy a few years ago and didn't tell anyone, and was just very alone in that. And I started my master's at Goldsmiths, and we were being asked to bring work into class, and I just didn't feel I could, because the only thing I was writing about was the thing I was keeping secret. Eventually I did start taking them to class and just saying that they were works of fiction, and got some very strange feedback. Sort of people were viewing the poems as at times violent, pessimistic, and basically not the attitude someone's meant to have towards these ideas of childbearing, right?
That's interesting. So they were giving you like emotional feedback rather than technical feedback.
Yeah, and that was a strange one, noticing the minute a woman's body is brought into a poem or a woman's autonomy, it suddenly doesn't matter too much what you're doing craft-wise. It's more about how you're presenting yourself. That was a strange one to contend with, but I just ignored it, which maybe isn't the best thing to do when you're meant to be receptive to feedback. But no, I just thought you're all wrong, and I'm allowed to feel the way I'm allowed to feel, and I think I'm expressing it correctly.
Did you feel like a set of social expectations around how you would feel, how you have to feel around pregnancy?
Yeah, definitely. And that was sort of exacerbated by the fact that I hadn't told anyone it was true. So it was, it was very much an odd one. But I'm happy now with how I've managed to piece that together in the collection.
Yeah. And the poem Moonfather won a prize, right?
Yeah, Moon Daddy. It was in the National Poetry Competition in 2019.
How many poems did you enter for it? Just the one?
Just the one, yeah.
So you felt very strongly about
that one, yeah. I wrote it, I think it was 8 minutes before the deadline. It was a first draft, and I just sent it in.
So that had some real energy in it. That had some real lightning.
I was like, go!
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, so did you hear about this competition from your masters?
No. I was always aware of it. It's run by the Poetry Society, and I've been a member since I was about 18. I used to go to events at the Poetry Cafe when that was up and running. So I was always sort of aware that was something that was running, and that it had a very good sort of, I mean, if you're one of the winners, you get a lot of opportunities coming out of that. But I never felt confident enough with my work until I'd written Moon Daddy, and then I was like, well, you know what, just send it off, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But it did work, so that was a relief.
So that's a lesson, right? Submit your work. You don't know what happened.
You should. The deadline this year is the 31st of October, and I implore everyone to try, because if you don't try, you don't know.
Do you want to tell us about the construction of the book? I think it's quite relevant in the way each poem is chosen.
Yeah, I mean, there was the sort of sense of like, I need to have a narrative here. They weren't written all in this like order, but I had to think about chronologically what would make sense. So it begins with Moon Daddy, Mother of Pearl, and Clinic, the Winter Self. So these are three sort of loss poems. The point of Ways of Healing is that you go through this loss and you find a way out of it, right? Which is why it ends with Ways of Healing. And in between you have all the sort of love poems, I guess, which I don't really do anymore. I have a strict no love poem policy. But
so you don't agree with your friend then, Ella?
Oh, Ella.
Yeah, she says every poem's a love poem.
Yeah, we've had arguments about this.
Are you the friend she was talking about?
Yeah, no more love poems. Yeah, we had a huge row over it. She said every poem is a love poem, and I said every poem is about war.
And the truth lies somewhere in between.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's a truth somewhere, in the middle of it all.
Yeah, so would you like to read Moon Daddy?
Yeah, of course. Moon Daddy. Today, the doctor asked if I was planning on keeping it. Right now, it is a grainy little moon, distorted by dark waves that I know, with the slightest change of tide, might pull us closer together. Being in love is like drowning in space, oh baby. You gaslight me so hard. The days when you pretend we do not know each other fill me with all this understanding for foxes, screaming in the night for want of sex. Imagine your reaction to something concrete, proof of a world in which we have both existed, momentarily, even if it is just this malformed pearl, ready to be crushed.
Wow, that's great. So it just brings to mind my what I think is the kind of the scan you go for, right? Like
yes, it's the ultrasound.
Yeah. Is that part of your thinking behind it?
Yes, for sure. The distorted waves, that was kind of the central image, and then I was thinking of the implications surrounding that image. So what's happening outside of that, and how does that tie it together?
And from looking at the poem here as you've been reading it on the page, it looks really important the way it's laid out, like formatting, actually the way that it's written. How important is that to you, the formatting of a poem, as opposed to speaking it, I suppose?
Massively, yeah. With this one, that you've got the gaps between certain lines. And for me, it was about this sense of like being separated from something. And the singular lines of drowning in space and the malformed pearl. It's the form is trying to reflect isolation in many ways, if that makes sense.
And I think so. This is the poem that you wrote in how many minutes?
8 minutes.
So I mean, that's incredible. That's incredibly lucky or incredibly skillful.
I agree. Normally, a poem takes me months. This one was just, I think when you reach the beginning of an idea, there's this sudden excitement and outburst of energy, and that's what that was.
Yeah, and I just wonder how much of this was kind of gestating in your mind as well, subconsciously before, like leading up to this.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I've been spending so much time thinking, well, I can't write about it because no one knows. And then I thought, nah, I'm gonna write
This is
it.
it. Yeah, everything
Just
on the
waiting
line.
to be burst out.
Yeah.
That's really great.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
so how did you do the ultrasound then? Months before, weeks before? What was the
Oh, it was
timeline?
months before.
Yeah.
I'd just been sat with that for a long time.
Mm.
A long time. It definitely was just sort of marinating inside me, like, you need to
Yeah.
talk about this.
Is it the did you write the poem or did the poem come out of you? You know?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's like I'm a strong believer now in telling people how you feel when you feel it. Because in the moment you just say how you're feeling, because I think otherwise it will come out at a later time in a non-relevant way.
Yeah, but how does it feel then to have to hide the truth for so long and then making it public for everyone?
Yeah. Yeah, very strange and upsetting too. I mean, it was hard with my parents, for example. That was quite difficult. Um, and it's taken time. But I guess like the one problem with Moon Daddy was that I hadn't told anyone, and then it was one of the winners in the national poetry competition. So it was a sudden, oh, now everyone knows. But I don't regret it. If I regret anything, it's just not having said anything sooner.
Yeah, that's just a lifelong journey of
Yeah, for sure.
how to communicate with people. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I was really interested in is Poetry Translation Center.
Yes,
So,
they're great.
The kind of work you do there.
Yeah, I've just finished my residency with them as part of the Undertow 8. So that was a collective of 8 young polylingual poets. And we could be writing primarily in English, but the point was to try and create work that brought in our native tongues as well. And it was brilliant. We got to go to the National Poetry Library in Manchester, and we had some really great discussions. The people that make up that group are all excellent in such unique ways. But yeah, with that's kind of how I started. In my newer work, there's a lot of Ukrainian words kind of included, and it gave me that sense of like permission to do that, and trust that if a reader is uncomfortable or confused, that they can, we have the internet at our disposal. You can Google what something means, and I shouldn't feel obliged to only write in English for a readership.
Yeah.
do some words in Ukrainian, they have like a specific emotional meaning for you, you know? Like,
For me, definitely. I tend to, the words that I'll have tend to relate to the domestic sphere. So types of food or clothing. And it's just sort of things that I remember a lot from childhood and from those visits to see my family. Those words like are special to me because they're words I remember from when I was a kid.
and I noticed because Eloise writes sometimes in French, sometimes in English, and I know sometimes the same word can, like you'd rather use the French version of that word because it means more to you in French than in English. It's hard to explain.
But then it's always tricky because I tend to write more in English now for the audience. Like I have the audience in mind more. And but yeah, I'm also working towards like getting rid of the audience and writing for myself, for people like
I
me,
really agree with that. I think if you're writing with someone in mind, you're maybe not writing honestly. The point is to be true to ourselves, and then the people that like that, they like that. And yeah, that's where I stand with it.
Do you plan to translate the words in the collection or just keep them untranslated?
I've been talking to Fiona about this. She believes I should have a glossary at the back of the collection so that people can go look um, if they feel the need, um, rather than have it translated on the page in a footnote or something. I think that would look a little bit clunky. Um, so definitely considering a glossary, but another part of me is so tempted to be like, no, you just
Just
Keep
look
it
for
mysterious.
you don't understand. You
Yeah.
don't understand.
Is it in the same alphabet as English?
No, it's not.
So it's hard to type out.
It's Cyrillic?
It's Cyrillic, yeah.
How close is Ukrainian to Russian?
Oh, loaded question.
Loaded question.
They're very different, but we use the same alphabet, and there are some words that have the same meaning.
Does your love for language include like linguistics?
I tried really hard with linguistics. At uni, I tried especially hard. I find it tricky because it feels formulaic and almost scientific, right? Which is, my brain does not work like that. Unfortunately, I have poetic logic only.
But it can also just be like playing with words or just interest in words in general.
Yeah, for sure. In that sense, yes, definitely. And that's what makes poetry fun, right? Is that we have time to play with the words before we put them out there.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a difference. I mean, I'm kind of ignorant about that, but maybe linguistics is more like the study of how words are used. And then it's kind of like literature is kind of more like the aesthetics of words and kind of playing with that, disrupting that.
Yeah. What did you study for your BA?
I did English with creative writing. I did that at Goldsmiths as well.
I'm interested to know what your studies brought to you in terms of your writing.
A lot, really. I would not be where I am without my personal tutor was Jack Underwood, and I studied with him for 5 years. And Jack's taught me literally everything I know. And I was very confused when I first started at my undergrad. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I began reading the work that Jack would bring to class, like contemporary poetry. It wasn't what we were looking at during A levels. It was people writing now. And I was so excited, and I didn't know that was allowed, or like, I don't know how to describe it, but I didn't know that people would be interested in that. And yet I was so interested in it, and other people in the class seemed to really engage with it.
Yeah, how did it feel for you to win the New Poets Prize for Ways of Healing and other prizes?
I thought it was a mistake. I thought they'd made a mistake. I was so in shock. But it's been a wonderful journey. For example, that Arvon course I got to go on was part of the prize, and that's afforded me a lot in terms of having met my mentor and exploring new spaces. So that was brilliant, and also just having this out now, Ways of Healing. It was a scary feeling, but also really reassuring that people liked it, and that it does deserve a space to exist in.
Yeah, and how's that doing? How's it being out in the world? It's
it's exciting to see. Like, I've had people in America post pictures with it, and I'm like, oh my god, it's made it to the States. So that's really funny to me, like very surreal. It's nice to have it out there, but the one thing is, and I've had discussions with people about this, and we're all sort of in agreement. I mean, I started writing this when I was 21, and I'm 25 now. It feels like a very old part of me. Something I'm like almost ready to move on from. But it's nice to have that like solid object that represents a whole time in your life.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Do you say you're kind of thinking about the future of future collections and future themes, and do you think healing is something that you're going to continue to explore, or do you almost feel like you've...
No, I think that's something I carry with me. I mean, Ways of Healing looks at healing in the context of child loss. But now I'm writing about famine and war, and there's a whole element of healing that comes in there. I'm sure that will still. I think it was more what I mean by Ready to Move On is that Ways of Healing was very personal, and I no longer feel the need to put that part of myself out there anymore. I'm ready to write about other people and other stories.
Do you think it was the publication of the book that made you move on, or is it just the natural curve of growing up and, you know, the evolution of your writing?
That's a really good question. I think the publication gives it a sense of finality, right? Like it is done now because it's out there, so you can't keep talking about it. So maybe that was like sort of the symbol of that coming to an end.
Yeah, with novelists, you know, usually they work years on a book, and then when the book comes out, finally everybody's, you know, the journalists and interviews are interested in asking questions about it, and they're done talking about it. You know, they're done with it emotionally. They want to move on, talk about new things, and they're estranged. They're kind of estranged from the content themselves. You know, they're kind of like, oh, I don't know what I was thinking back then.
Yeah. I have a similar thing where I'm like, I can't relate to love poems anymore, for example. And there's so many dotted about in that collection that it kind of frustrates me.
Yeah. Does your next collection have a title yet?
It does, yeah. It's still a work in progress, but it's called Birth in Reverse.
Birth in Reverse. Creating some movement towards it, you know, some excitement towards reading your next collection.
You mentioned earlier that the New York Times got in touch with you about your writing. How did they find you, and do you feel kind of pressure having to almost kind of represent Ukraine in some minor way?
They found me on Twitter because at the time the visas weren't being granted to refugees, and so my family was still stuck there. So I was tweeting a lot about that, trying to sort of drum up some kind of attention towards it. And Megan Spethia, who is a journalist for the New York Times, found my tweet and got in touch, and we had a long phone call to discuss it. There's definitely a sense of pressure because, like earlier, you know, you were asking how similar are Russian and Ukrainian. That I feel like a pressure, like I have to get this right, and if I don't get this right, I'm letting people down, right? So it's really hard, but I'm trying. But yeah, I do find if I'm kind of stuck on something, I will normally call my mum and be like, so what's your thoughts on this? She knows better.
Yeah, is your mum Ukrainian then?
Yes, yeah.
A poem I really like personally of yours is the one you wrote about Chernobyl.
Oh, Radiant Summers, yeah.
Would you mind reading this for us?
Yeah, of course. I think I've got it on my phone. Radiant Summers. She laid in the clay of Chernobyl lakes that summer. I think of her when I whiten my teeth, see my shoelaces in a nightclub, her child body glowing on the dance floor. I think of her when I disco, when I denim. I think of her when I pray, although I do not pray. I think of her when a man describes me as radiant. Her small throat turned purple like a walnut. You could see it through her skin, more a veil, hardly protective. Nothing could have protected her. I think of her when I introduce myself as Ukrainian and am met with, oh, Chernobyl. I think of how a country, a time, a girl are all defined by disaster. I think of the implications of disaster, meaning unavoidable, the will of God, a nuclear immaculate conception. If I could carry her like a tumor, I would. If I could confer with God, I'd know there isn't one. In his place, a voice of pure panic, white hot and stinging.
Wow.
Just devastatingly powerful stuff.
Thank you.
This is
It makes me think all poems are about war now.
They are.
I mean, I don't. For me, that's not about war, though. Maybe I'm totally wrong, of course. But for me, it's about kind of privilege, or that's my reading of it. Is that
I'm always thinking about this term disaster because it kind of implies that there's no one at fault, when the reality of so many disasters is that they're not disasters, they are man-made. And I think about that in terms of Chernobyl, I think about that in terms of the famine, and I think about that in terms of the war.
I think that's why I said war, is because it's all like the political and human implications.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly where I'm at as well.
And I find it very interesting, this perspective of like the outsider, like in Britain or anywhere else in the world that's not Ukraine, is like Ukraine. I mean, I'm not talking for every other country, but like Ukraine is Chernobyl, and that's you hit that on the nail,
Yeah, I mean, growing up, whenever I would mention where I was from, that was usually the response I got.
Yeah.
Which made me feel kind of dirty in a way.
And I think many countries have that misperception,
Yeah.
non-Western countries in a way.
Yeah.
It's all like negative feelings, negative like disasters, as you say, like poverty.
Yeah, there's always these negative connotations.
Yeah.
Associated. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as well. There's almost like a kind of, it's kind of like a survivor's guilt kind of situation going on there, where when you say, like, when someone says that I'm radiant, I think of someone being suffering with radiation or something like that. It's almost like these people are really close to your heart, even in your safety.
Yeah, for sure. And it doesn't leave you. And we carry, as Ukrainians, we carry these cultural traumas with us always. And they do, they do influence the everyday.
So it's just something that you've embraced. You said, like, it was kind of an annoyance when people would bring it up, and it's kind of like, there's more. Obviously, there's more to my culture than to my country and my culture than that.
Yeah, and there's value in discussing that and trying to bring those nuances in. That's what I've really learned the past year of writing this collection. That it needs to be spoken about. It needs to be addressed.
In the poem, who in your mind was her or she?
I was thinking of my mother, because that's where she used to summer in Chernobyl, and they'd left about 2 days before the disaster. They'd driven home, and I always think of what could have happened if they hadn't.
Yeah.
I think that's why I love also you writing about folklore, because it's bringing that other gaze as well. It's Ukraine is not just disasters.
No, it's such a rich culture of like food and stories and women. I find it a very admirable culture. And yeah, I'm definitely trying to create this balance in the new work of, it's not just all disaster. Like, there is beauty to it.
Well, we're really looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
And and people listening should really pick up this new Poets Prize, new Poets Prize, Ways of Healing, from Charlotte, because it is a really, really beautiful collection.
And where can you find it?
You can get it through the Poetry Business, Waterstones, Foils, Blackwell's, I think, as well. If you Google Ways of Healing, Charlotte Shevchenko Knight, you'll find the links.
And where can we follow you or hear about you?
My Instagram is Lottie Shevchenko, and my Twitter is Shevchenko Knight.
Beautiful.
Wonderful.
Well,
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today, Charlotte.
Thank you for having me. It's been really
it's been a real pleasure.
You guys.
It was a pleasure talking to you, and see you next time, listeners.
Thank you for joining us again.
Reste deux femmes et un parapluie au coin de la rue. Papotage féminin de bord. La brunerie.
Thank you for listening to Poetry to Your Ears.
Côté de la rue.
This podcast is published as a newsletter on Substack. All of our content is published for free, but if you would like to support our work, you can become a paid subscriber. This will help us support transcripts for the deaf and hard of hearing community, and anyone who would benefit from reading the podcast alongside hearing it. You can also support us for free by rating the show on Spotify and Apple Podcast, or writing a review on Apple Podcast. Share the show with your friends, fellow poets, and poetry lovers. If you want to interact with us, you can follow us on @poetry2yourears on Instagram and @poetry2 on Twitter, or you can also write a comment on Substack. If you're American and you're listening to us, send us a message. Half of our listeners are American. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time!